Let's now cut across to Kyiv in Ukraine, where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is now addressing media.
Thank you as well for the very good exchange that we had, as well as the very positive consultations with President Zelensky a little bit earlier. Let me just begin by why I'm here in Kyiv today. First and foremost, it is to reaffirm the United States' unwavering support for Ukraine at a time when its security, its prosperity, its democracy, its fundamental right to exist as a sovereign, independent nation are facing an unprecedented challenge from Russia. The Ukrainian people are no strangers to conflict. Since Ukrainians took to the Maidan 8 years ago to defend their choice for a democratic and European future, Russia has used every strategy in its playbook to try to undermine the will of the Ukrainian people. Since 2014, Moscow manufactured a crisis and invaded Ukraine's territory in Crimea, which it occupies to this day. Moscow orchestrated a war in eastern Ukraine, which it continues to fuel using proxy forces that it leads, trains, equips, and finances. Moscow has systematically sought to weaken Ukraine's democratic institutions, as well as to divide Ukrainian society, using everything from election interference to disinformation to cyber attacks. And Russia has also attempted to destabilize the economic and financial situation in Ukraine, and we are working together to mitigate those efforts. As we meet today, Russia has ratcheted up its threats and amassed nearly 100,000 forces on Ukraine's border, which it could double on relatively short order. We know, the Ukrainian people know, that Moscow's aggression to this point has killed more than 14,000 Ukrainian men, women, and children, and driven more than 1.4 million Ukrainians from their homes. The human toll of aggression would be many magnitudes higher if it were to be renewed. That's why President Biden asked me to come here, to underscore our steadfast commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it's why we will continue our relentless diplomatic efforts to prevent renewed aggression and to promote dialogue and peace. At the same time, we continue to bolster Ukraine's ability to defend itself and make clear the costs that the United States and Europe will impose on Moscow if it rejects the diplomatic path that we've laid out and proceeds with an unwarranted, unprovoked, unacceptable invasion or destabilization of Ukraine. For years, we've invested in Ukraine's economic growth, energy security, infrastructure, civil society, rule of law, and defense. We're continuing to provide that support, including defensive security assistance. This support has strong bipartisan backing in the United States. That was evident in the Senate delegation that was here just yesterday, as well as the House delegation that came in December. It's the message that the United States Congress sent in December by extending the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative through 2022 and increasing its funding to $300 million. Second, I came to Kyiv to speak in person with the President, my friend Dmytro, other senior Ukrainian government leaders about the intensive week of diplomacy that we've just engaged in with Russia, both through the bilateral strategic stability dialogue, through the NATO-Russia Council, and at the OSCE, and now to consult and coordinate on the next steps forward. We had the meetings that I described. Immediately before those engagements, the NATO foreign ministers met to pursue our coordinated response to Moscow's military buildup, and the NATO-Ukraine Commission met as well. Across all of these diplomatic engagements, we've been firm in our principles and clear about the areas where we can make progress. One of the principles which you've heard us repeat, but it always bears repeating, is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. The same is true for the trajectory of Europe as a whole. Nothing about Europe and its security without Europe. That's been our message in public. It's been our message in private. We've consistently practiced what we preach. In recent weeks alone, we've conducted more than 100 diplomatic consultations, including with Ukraine, with NATO, with the European Union, with the OSCE, the Bucharest 9, various member states of these organizations, to ensure that we're aligned and speaking clearly with one voice. Throughout, we have made clear our strong preference for a diplomatic path to de-escalate conflict with Russia. That is the responsible course. And it's also why I'm heading to Berlin after this to consult with several of our closest European partners. And it's why I'll meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov in the Russian Federation in Geneva on Friday. The objectives of that meeting were one of the key topics that President Zelensky, Foreign Minister Kuleba, and I discussed earlier today. And as we've consistently done, we will brief our Ukrainian partners shortly after the meeting in Geneva as well and discuss next steps. The world is watching what's happening here. When Russia uses its strength to act with impunity against another sovereign nation, it makes other countries think that they too can violate the rules of international peace and security and put their narrow interests ahead of the shared interests of the international community. Third, the strength of our diplomacy, our deterrence, and any response to Moscow's aggression demands unity among allies and partners, as well as within Ukraine. That's a point I underscored today in the meetings with President Zelensky and with the foreign minister. Ukrainians have to stick together, especially at this time. President Zelensky continues to advance important reform efforts, including recently judicial reform, despite the external challenges and pressure that he's facing. To that end, I would urge the SAPO Selection Commission to complete the last step of their work without delay and finalize their selection. Now, as we know, one of Moscow's long-standing goals has been to try to sow divisions within Ukraine, to make it harder for Ukrainians to work together, to realize their Euro-democratic ambitions, to claim that democracy is a recipe for polarization and dysfunction. Ukraine has to avoid any actions that help Russia in the cynical effort. Don't let Moscow divide you. That means that leaders inside and outside Ukraine's government have to put aside their differences in favor of the shared national interest and work together to prepare for what could be difficult days. But in doing that, the United States wants you to know this. As you stand up to efforts to divide, to intimidate, to threaten, the United States stands with you resolutely in your right to make decisions for your own future, to shape that future as Ukrainians for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question will go to Will Malden of the Wall Street Journal, please.
Thank you so much. For Secretary Blinken, I wanted to ask you about any new types of assistance you may have discussed providing to Ukraine. Did you discuss potentially offensive weapons or air defenses or contingency plans for if Russia does cross the border, or the possibility the U.S. would transfer licenses of weapons that it has supplied to other countries to Ukraine? And then just following up on that, is there a reason why the Biden administration a year on hasn't nominated an ambassador to Ukraine? For Mr. Kuleba, similar question. I wanted to ask you if there's anything that the U.S. or Europe...
That was the joint press conference between the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and, of course, the Ukraine Foreign Minister. The U.S. yet again reaffirming its unwavering support for Ukraine amid fears of Russian invasion. Secretary Blinken clearly said that Ukraine is no stranger to conflict. Russia has now increased its threats with almost 100,000 troops at the Ukraine border. The U.S. clearly says that it is now underscoring its commitment to promote peace and also bolster Ukraine's ability to defend itself in case of a possible invasion by Russia. That, of course, is what the West fears at this point.